this is Don's fourth speech in his Peter Pan series of speeches. The title is called Mermaids Demystified. In the story of Peter Pan, we know that there are mermaids that live in Neverland. Other than the fact that Peter Pan would have conversations and play games with the mermaids, there is not much mention about them in the book. In fact, most people do not know much about mermaids. Today, Don will be speaking about mermaids in general, enlightening us to the truths of real mermaids. But be careful. Don is an experienced teller of tall tales, and you'll never know when he might try to spin one on you. Please help me welcome Don Mathews.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guests, mermaids. In the Peter Pan book, there wasn't much mentioned about mermaids, but there are a lot of literary works about mermaids. When reading the book Peter Pan, I've come up with a couple of questions that I've always wondered. One is, are they really friendly? Second is, are they for real? And of course, third, what kind of games do they like to play? Because Peter Pan had mentioned that they like to play games. First, let's start with, are they really friendly? Well, going back to Greek mythology, the Greeks wrote about sirens. And sirens were women that were on the islands that would sing to the sailors as they came by, bringing them in only to wreck their ships and crash and die in the sea. Nothing more than mischievous. But every story needs a good antagonist, and this is where the sirens came up with. Now, the story of mermaids started in Assyria about 1000 BC. And at that time, the first mention of it was a woman who was ashamed of her husband's death and felt so bad on the inside. She wanted to die in the sea and become a fish. But because she was so beautiful, only the bottom half of her became fish, and thus a mermaid. The first notion of a mermaid came into existence. Now, some writers would get the sirens and the mermaids confused. So in short, mermaids are very friendly. In fact, most stories written about mermaids are love stories. A man falls in love with a mermaid, and the mermaid wants to be a land creature. Or a man falls in love with a mermaid and wants to become a merman. A merman? Yes, mermen exist too. However, there's not much written about it because everything that is written about mermen seem to say the same thing. They're very ugly creatures, and they're not very social either. But in reality, all species need a male and a female, unless, of course, you're a fungus or a plant. So the next question is, are they real? And I believe they absolutely are. There is proof that there are mermaids. Christopher Columbus wrote in his logbook sightings of mermaids. Blackbeard wrote in his book sightings of mermaids. And there have been recent sightings of mermaids in Vancouver, Canada, Israel, and Zimbabwe. And the real proof is the U.S. government. I'll quote you from the National Ocean Service, a U.S. entity. They stated in 2012, and I quote, "No evidence," you hear that? "No evidence of aquatic humanoids have ever been found." This is a U.S. entity we're talking about here. Other U.S. entities have also said things like extraterrestrial life does not exist. And because we have Star Trek, we know that it does. And this other U.S. entity, the Board of Health, said thimerosal is perfectly fine to use in vaccines, knowing full well thimerosal is mercury. So whenever a U.S. entity says something, you can almost be assured that the opposite is true. Therefore, mermaids exist. Now the games mermaids play. I'm going to tell you a story of a game, how it got invented, and where it came from, because it came from the mermaids. 1954, there's a man named Alan Blake, and he was a scuba diver. In those days, there was no such thing as scuba diving, but Alan Blake wanted to make scuba diving the praxis of the industry. The Royal Navy hired him to do a very top secret project. What they wanted to do was fix the bottoms of their boats without having to bring them into the marinas. Alan Blake came up with a way to stay underwater for a couple of days so that that project can be completed. Well, naturally, an accident happened, and he fell 130 feet to the bottom of the ocean and was pinned with his breathing apparatus. All he could do for 24 hours was just breathe. No chance of any rescue. But then a mermaid found him pinned, and she brought him to a cavern with air in it. And that served as a decompression chamber, because every diver knows that if you're down that far for that long, you can't come to the surface or you will explode. So he had to decompress for 24 hours now. And what to do for 24 hours? Well, he did the same thing that Peter Pan did. He had good conversations with the mermaids, and he played games. The mermaids enjoyed him a lot, and they made him a new pair of fins. They also gave him a dive mask with a new snorkel and ear protection so that they could play this game. They also gave him a glove to protect his hand on the coral. And as a complimentary gift, a bottle of mermaid spit to keep the mask clean. And then a pair of hockey sticks. Yes, the game of Octopush is what they called it. And to this day, once Alan Blake surfaced and came to the surface, he came, and to this day we call this underwater hockey. And there you have it. Fellow Toastmasters, mermaids are friendly, mermaids are real, and underwater hockey is the underwater world champion sport. Mr. Toastmaster. Thank you very much.
And lastly, let me bring up Jim to evaluate Don. Jim.
Well, I thought Don got my attention immediately with the questions that he started with. And that framed the entire speech for me. And then you moved into talking about answering those questions. I was particularly impressed with the mermaid description. I've often wondered which came first, the mer or the maid. And you explained that to us, that instead of a fish that stopped its evolution halfway through, we had a human who decided to use the power of mind and emotion over matter to change the bottom part of her anatomy. And then, as an offset to that, you brought in about mermen. I never heard of mermen before, but it really kind of made me stop and think about the mermaid. And then you moved into this very interesting series of arguments about proof about mermaids. And you had some very creative things there about Christopher Columbus mentioning it, and then you moved on into the U.S. National Oceanographic. And one of the things that points out is it's one thing to say we can't prove something exists. It's another thing to say you can't prove it doesn't exist either. And you reminded me of an argument one of my partners made in court once when, after he finished his argument, the judge said, "Do you have any authority for your position?" There was a long pause, and he said, "Judge, I've said it many times myself." The creative, very creative sort of ending part with the hockey, the underwater hockey, that was kind of a twist. And that got got me thinking a little bit, but then you moved into using the props, which I'd been wondering all the while what you were going to do with them. So if I had any suggestion at all, it would be to make a little better use of the props. And perhaps you could have worked in the use of the props when you were talking about the mermaids playing with him and telling us how they prepared him to be able to play with them underwater. I think that would have been a very effective use of those and bringing them in and playing with them a little rather than throwing them on the floor. This flowed particularly well. I've heard your other 3 speeches about the Peter Pan series, and I liked this one the best personally. It was the most creative, I think, of the other ones. You had some good research into this and some great storytelling. Nicely done.